Welcome everyone to AsiaLink's webinar, The Next US President. Before we begin today, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all dialing in from. For me, that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and community. I pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This evening's webinar will be recorded and available to view on AsiaLink's YouTube channel. If you have any questions for the panelists, we encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens, and we will endeavor to answer these all at the end of the session. I will now introduce our esteemed panel. Please join me in welcoming Professor Chee, Ambassador at Large with the Singapore Foreign Ministry and Global Co-Chair of the Asia Society, Professor Ryo Suhashi, Professor of International Relations at the University of Tokyo, and Professor James Curran, International Editor at the Australia Financial Review and Professor of History at the University of Sydney. Finally, I would like to introduce today's moderator, John McCarthy. John is the former Australian ambassador to Vietnam, Mexico, Thailand, and the United States, Indonesia, Japan, and the former High Commissioner to India. Of course, John is also a senior advisor for us here at AsiaLink, and I'll now pass over to him to begin the conversation. Thank you, John.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Leah. I'm delighted that the panel has agreed to appear today. We've had, of course, quite a week. And everybody around the world has been watching with fascination as the results of the American presidential election have come in. Today's panel, we're looking particularly at the likely external policies of the new Trump administration. There is a deal of speculation as to whether Trump's foreign policy will be transactional, as was evidenced at times during his first administration, or might still follow some of the mainstream lines of the former administration, particularly in relation to China. Obviously, there's considerable speculation as to exactly what will happen in the three key areas of strategic risk for the United States, and that's particularly the Ukraine and Europe, it's Gaza and the remainder of the Middle East, and of course it's East Asia, particularly the United States dealings with China. I'm honored with the panel that have agreed to appear today, and without more, I'd like to ask Chee to give her perspective of the impact of the new Trump administration, particularly on Southeast Asia, and taking into account, of course, the importance of the United States relationship with China. So Chee, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, and good evening to all members of the audience who are tuned in to watch this webinar. Donald Trump has been elected the 47th President of the United States. It was not a surprise for Southeast Asian countries that he should win. I think most of us thought he had a 50% chance or maybe more than 50% chance of winning the election. But the fact that it was so decisive and so swiftly concluded, was a surprise, because US media had led us to believe that this was a very close race. In fact, it doesn't seem to be close at all. Now, it's interesting to watch a Channel News Asia program. It's a Singapore TV program whose footprint covers from Japan to India. This program was to take a sense of the man in the street, woman in the street, just 2 days before the US elections. And individuals were approached to ask who do they want to win the elections. In the Philippines, most of those who were interviewed said they wanted Trump to win, the men especially. A couple of women said perhaps Kamala. Philippines has a very macho culture. But in Indonesia, the men approached, the Indonesian men, they all said they wanted Trump to win because he could end the war. Maybe one or two women said Kamala. In Malaysia, the same thing. Men and women, Malays, were approached to and they were asked, who would you like to see win the election? And they said Trump, because he can and or he will end the war. So that's the reaction. In Singapore, far more people said Kamala. There was one young man who was a bit apologetic, and he said, maybe Trump, because you see, I'm a cryptocurrency dealer. So he voted for Trump. But that gives you an idea of the mood in Asia. At the leaders level, I would say all of them feel we have dealt with Trump before. We dealt with Trump in the first administration. There are, of course, great anxieties over tariffs and the security policies. But this has not been expressed aloud. Was there Trump proofing? Is not a word we would use in Southeast Asia. So, and it's not evident that there was Trump proofing before, and maybe people are now trying to scramble to see what they can do. In fact, if I can use this word, there was relative calm in the region, no panic. And if you read the headlines of just a conference that was held yesterday in Singapore, the Future Asia Summit, that were organized by the Straits Times of Singapore Press Holdings. Quite a few speakers from the region, China included, Indonesia, and so on. People seem to say that it may not be as bad as you think. Could be an Asian optimism, you can say. There was hyperventilation in the US, and everybody said this election will be a game changer. Trump 2.0 is not the same as Trump 1.0. You can expect the unpredictable. But my take is that there will be a major shakeup, but the shakeup will be internal to the US more than it will be to the external environment. There will be changes, to be sure. Let's look at the wars. Let's look at security, what is expected. But I think the change, if you look at who's being appointed, the domestic appointments that affect domestic policy, like witness, the Attorney General that's just named is Matt Gaetz. So I think the radical transformation could be targeted internally. What does it mean for ASEAN, for Southeast Asia? Higher tariffs. And for those who are treaty allies and defense partners, we would be asked to pay more. There will be no free riders. We expect President Trump would scrap IPEF. But IPEF never gave us market access. In the 4 pillars, we were asked to do things in supply chain, trade, and so on. But for ASEAN countries, the importance of IPEF was that it kept US engaged in trade in the region. But we were hoping for markets, but there are no markets. And many ASEAN countries signed on. We are most concerned with the US-China relationship because it sets the tone for the stability of the region. The China policy will ricochet on Southeast Asia. Will be collateral damage. And we believe personnel is policy. And if you look at who's appointed, well, J.D. Vance is the vice president and he's tough on China. Mike Pompeo, though, did not make the administration. But Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, they are hardliners on China. And Frank Hesseth is a lawless from Fox News. There are many people who are MAGA people, who are joining. So I think what the impact on China policy would be interesting. One thing to remember is I do not believe President Trump is a hawk's hawk. Probably in the MAGA movement, he may be more moderate than the others. And he's also a man who does not like war. That's what everybody says. And Robert O'Brien, in a recent foreign affairs article, reminded us that in his 4 years in office, in the first term, Trump did not start a new war. So, that's something to bear in mind. I expect he will push things right to the edge, but he's unpredictable. The tariff war with China will affect ASEAN countries. Trade will certainly slow down. Many of us are part of the production platform for goods exported to the US. And certainly ASEAN countries have been recently benefiting from the diversified supply chain. Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, even Singapore, we have benefited from the China Plus One strategy. And we will worry about extra sanctions, the sanctions which are now going to be slapped on countries where the loophole for sanctions for goods going into US would be found produced. I think whether it's a Democratic administration or a Republican administration, the tightening of sanctions on the plus one countries would be there. ASEAN is most concerned about the decoupling of trade and investments, which we think will likely go through. In fact, there are companies in the region, certainly in Singapore, that are looking to see what they need to do if there's decoupling. You know, are they going to set up two companies, two offices, and so on? So there's a lot of worry about the decoupling of the economies. Now, President Trump is not keen on multilateralism, so probably ASEAN would not expect him to attend the ASEAN meetings much. We hope he will. In his first term, he did not hold the US-ASEAN summit, and he did not attend, I think, the East Asian summit. I would say the US administrations will pay a lot of attention to Indonesia because it's the biggest country, it's a democracy, it's a Muslim country, and I expect President Trump's administration will pay attention to Indonesia. As we all know, President Prabowo had a conversation with President Trump-elect, the President-elect Trump. And all indications are that Indonesia will work with him, President Prabowo, in his first trip out, visited China, then he's in the US, he's going to Peru, Brazil, and he's throwing in the United Kingdom as well, which shows that Indonesia is interested in maintaining good relationships with everyone. And remember, bear in mind, Indonesia has critical minerals that the United States wants. So it will work out a relationship. Now, so let me conclude by saying, I believe Southeast Asian leaders will be flexible. They will work with whoever America votes for as president. We are a grouping of small and middle-sized countries. We're not a threat to the US in any way, and we are certainly not high on their priority list. But President Trump is unpredictable. In the next 4 years, anything can happen. He may see ASEAN as a swing vote in this contest between the United States and China. And who knows, he may turn more to ASEAN and Southeast Asia. I think that's all I have to say.
Thanks very much, and Heng Chee, that was great. Look, now I'm changing the arrangement slightly. Would either of the other two members of the panel like to put a question to Heng Chee? Okay, if not, I have one. That is this: given the sort of approaches that seem to be heralded to the United States sort of approaches that the administration is making on Ukraine, the comments that are being made on Ukraine, what do you think might be the impact in Asia, China, Japan, and Southeast Asia, if effectively the Americans are seen to be abandoning Ukraine, as is currently being debated? In other words, putting pressure on Ukraine to reach an agreement with Russia, which is totally unsatisfactory to Ukraine and to the Europeans. What sort of impact would that have, do you think, on the region?
Well, let me say that for many of the Southeast Asian countries, they were not and they did not want sanctions imposed on Russia. They have relationships with Russia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and quite a few countries. So they would like to see the war end. And if Russia comes out better as a winner, getting some territory out of the settlement, I don't think it will bother them in any way. Singapore will be looking at this because we always have this idea that you cannot breach the international charter, a big country going into a small country. And I think we would sort of raise our eyebrows if Russia comes out with a third of the territory, but if that's the settlement, that's the settlement. It's not very good. Now, the question is, how will Taiwan look on this? And how will China look on this? I would say that, in the past, any discussion of Ukraine and China always focused on what is the impact of Ukraine on Taiwan, the Ukraine war. In the beginning, yes, of course, China was shocked at how SWIFT was used, shocked at the freezing of assets, and shocked at how quickly NATO came together. Nobody seems to ask what is the impact on Taiwan, seeing what happens, and Taiwan has watched what the war means. Will Taiwanese men fight as much? One. Secondly, there were no boots on the ground from the United States, and the aid packages was difficult to, was held up and so on. And now if there's a quick settlement in this way, I think the Taiwanese will look, and internally there may be some concern, must be some concern, though they will not say it aloud.
Well, thank you very much. Over now, thank you very much indeed, Chee. That was great. Now over to Yo from Tokyo.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to this important panel after important event in Washington, D.C. So I totally agree with Ambassador and Professor Chee's point that we have a lot of worries about Trump treatment of multilateralism and trade, free trade and economic affairs. Many Japanese policymakers worry so much about the future of rules-based order, especially from economic angle. Of course, from Trump administration, we have been to some extent reassured about the future of regional security. But we also have some worries about, kind of the handle. How can they handle the issues so well about security affairs? But we have more worries about economic affairs. This is my first take. Having said that, I think the Japanese government has well prepared for the second Trump administration, maybe more than other governments in Asia. We, try to hedge against the second Trump administration last few years. But at the same time, I sometimes think, even though how much we prepared, it is too difficult to handle the issue, right? Because, we have been try to prepare a Trump administration for a few years, we still have kind of feeling of optimism that we can handle Trump. We can manage the second Trump administration, like what we did in the first Trump administration. I feel like, our memory is too short, right? We have to remember, in the year 2020, we had discussed always if Trump would be elected again against Biden, our international order would be total chaos. We talked like that 4 years ago, right? Even in Japan, or maybe in Canberra, in Singapore, in any parts of Asia and the world. But last 4 years, we just forget such a thing, such a big fear about the Trump administration. And at least in Japan, I sometimes encounter the people with optimism. But, this one, the second Trump administration might be more tougher, too tougher for Japan, too tough for Japan to stand. This is, my big worries. And for example, like on security issue, as I said, now we start to hear the names like Marco Rubio as State Secretary, Mike Waltz as the National Security Advisor. Both are kind of super hawkish or uber hawkish in Congress. But somebody said even in Tokyo, oh, they know China challenge, rise of China had many trouble with us. So, that might be good news for Japan and for Asia, they say. But I don't think so, to some extent, right? Of course, to some extent, we could be reassured to some extent, right? Because Trump administration might be tough on China, say on security issue, security challenge, and also economic security challenge. That might be fine for us. But on the other side, we have to be reminded that, for example, Marco Rubio, he was super hawkish against China from ideological reason, right? Very ideological hawkish against China. He is really, really against the Chinese Communist Party's regime and also Chinese treatment of human rights. Of course, we have worries about CCP and we have worries about human rights in China, but their approach, US hawkish, super hawkish people's approach on China could be too much hawkish, right? And if now they will be like a secretary or national security advisor, we have worries. They might be, too pushy against the Chinese governance. And they might not have enough chance to talk with Chinese counterparts to settle down the military disputes or military crisis, right? So this is my concern. And, like over Taiwan, if they start the new discussion about strategic ambiguity, it could cause another, tension between Washington and Beijing. But for example, Mike Waltz, new security advisor to Donald Trump, he wrote in his book about strategic clarity should be replaced to strategic ambiguity to make deterrence work better. This is very debatable, but, such a signaling to China might be too tough. And, and we really need to talk with United States. What would be the best approach to, China issue, Taiwan issue, right? So this is my concern. On Korea, this is totally different issue. Totally different issue. Of course, I don't think, Donald Trump would fly to Pyongyang in the day one or even day 100. He wouldn't try to fly to Pyongyang. But, I don't know, about the future. He has 4 years. After Ukraine, after Middle East, Donald Trump may want to go the negotiation with North Korea, right? And he would be able to make a big concession to Pyongyang, like, admit North Korea as nuclear state, as they say in the constitution. It is my worries, right? So this is my second point. And third point is coming back to our common concerns, Trump, America First approach to economic affairs. IPEF Indo-Pacific economic framework might be killed by Trump administration. Paris Agreement, or he may go somewhere, right? And also, as my previous speaker says, they may push more to decoupling a policy. At least, under the campaign, Trump people repeatedly say risking, diversification, small yard high fence are the concepts which they don't like, right? They dearly believe decoupling should be the keyword for the next administration. And now they won the presidential race. So I have so much worries about decoupling effort. Of course, to some extent, we can come up with United States for economic security because we believe it is what we have to do, right? We have to do some extent economic security, right, to defend our technology and to promote, our joint development of the advanced technology among allies, including Australia, Japan, United States, and other countries, right? Japan has big hope to join the AUKUS arrangement for the Tier 2 cooperation. But at the same time, if Trump administration go too much to decoupling of Chinese economies, it will not make sense for us, right? So this is my big worries. My final point is Japan can do. How can Japan manage the situation? I have big worries about my countries, right? We just had snap election. And Ishiba Shigeru, our prime minister, lost many seats in lower house, we call House of Representatives, but he still keep his administration. He just been re-elected as our prime minister. But we don't know how long he could keep his power. At least academically, I have to say, it is very difficult to imagine he will keep his power for 4 years, right? So, we don't have political stability anymore in Japan. In the last time of Trump administration, we had Shinzo Abe. He was really good negotiator with Trump, but also, more importantly, Prime Minister Abe had political stability in Japan. But now, Ishiba or the next forthcoming prime ministers will not have political stability. This is my worries, right? How could we make good friendship with United States? How could we make good negotiation with United States? I have big worries about that. So I stop here and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Yo. Look, questions from either James or Chee to Yo?
Yeah, I've got a question. Thanks very much. I mean, I think you put your finger on it there, Yo, right at the end about the need for allies to handle Trump. Surely you need, above all else, political stability, a combination of political stability and diplomatic guile and a certain agility. And the worry is that with the situation in Japan, that is not there. Certainly, as you say, a contrast to Abe. And as we know, Ishiba came into power with a lot of very interesting ideas about an Asian NATO or revising the Status of Forces Agreement, even the US-Japan Security Treaty. So, and there's also, I mean, the Trump's coming has given rise to some other interesting statements from Japanese foreign policy advisors, for example. And one of them said last week, as I understand it, that if Trump is elected, this is a great opportunity for Japan to become truly independent. And he was even talking about 85% of the airspace over Japan is dominated by the United States, and this will be an opportunity for us to sort of strike a new deal. But I'm assuming that was a bit of excited talk, and that it will be very difficult to translate that into reality.
Yo?
Yep.
Any
Thank
comments?
you very, Thank you very much, Professor Curran. And yes, Ishiba has many ideas, Asian NATO, or review of SOFA, state of force agreement with United States, and also nuclear sharing. My personal hope is he will not bring such agendas to Trump. Because the first thing he has to talk with Trump is beyond his ideas, right? Ishiba has to talk with Trump about the regional security issue or international economic framework, right? Like, if Ishiba start to talk about SOFA, it is really bilateral negotiation with United States, and United States people, I mean, Trump administration people would say to Ishiba that if you want to review a SOFA arrangement with us, you have to pay more. It is crazy, right? It is super difficult negotiation with Trump administration. What can we, bring to the table? We don't know, right? He is not a good counterpart to talk. So, and Ishiba will, is not with strong political stability. So, he simply brings new ideas, but, because he doesn't have strong stability, in Japan, his bargaining power against the United States might be very weak. So, I'm afraid he would be forced to make a big concession against the United States. So, without getting something, simply, make big concession. So, I really hope my administration, my government, keep the priority of the diplomacy with Trump administration. We have to explain what we, like G7 and Australia, have to do in this international society, right? So, but I have big worries about that. But the second point, just before forgetting, James, you reminded me the very important things. If Trump administration make very unique behaviors and make a very bad deal with North Korea, or even with China, with Moscow, I mean Russia, that might cause the crisis of credibility, right? And after crisis of credibility, I'm afraid this country or anywhere in the world, many people start to doubt the usability or the importance of the relationship with the United States, and they strongly, propose we have to go more autonomy. I'm not fan of Plan B ideas. We have to go Plan A. We can make a Plan A plus alpha, but Plan B type of ideas might be caused after we see big loss of credibility of the United States in the world.
Thank you very much, Joe. I just wonder if Chee has any questions to put to you.
I was just looking at the time, John, but my sense about the North Korean situation is that the fact that Kim Jong-un has a new ally in Russia is something he would treasure, but he really would like to talk to the United States because he wants sanctions lifted, and only the United States can do that. But the situation is very different now in the Korean Peninsula. President Yoon is much more hardline on North Korea than his predecessor was, Moon Jae-in. So this situation is not so, can you actually bring about talks with President Trump, should he, during the Yoon administration, want to reach out to Kim Jong-un? Do you think it is possible?
I think Donald Trump and his administration will not take care so much about our perspectives, right? I mean, Seoul perspective and Tokyo perspectives on North Korea. Maybe, if we find out good friends in Trump administration, like in the first Trump administration, we can prevent the very bad deal making with Pyongyang. But, this administration, the second administration, I think we firstly have to find out good friends in White House and, in Trump administration government, right? We really need leverage. We really need channels, to stop Trump, to jump into the negotiation with Pyongyang. So, but I don't think, I'm really pessimistic about that at this moment.
Thank you very much, Yo. Look, it's time now, I think, to move to James and look forward to hearing what you have to say, James. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, John. Thanks for having me on this panel. Look, I'll go back to Tokyo, where I was a few weeks ago, actually, and a senior Japanese national security official said to me that as I asked him about how Japan was feeling about the coming US election, he said, any US election is really like getting a Christmas present from a relative. When you open it up, you have to like it, whether you like it or not. Now, I think we all know so much about Trump's style from the first administration, dealing with this individual who really is very much a man without moorings, who can decide on a whim and turn on a dime. Is very difficult. Now, the thing that is different, though, this time, I think, is two things. One is the transition seems to me to be a lot better organised. We know that last time they weren't expecting to win. But his chief of staff said in Las Vegas recently to Republican donors that the administration had 2 years to revolutionise government. And I think this goes to Chee's earlier point about just how much of a priority domestic affairs will be in this administration. The other difference of style, of course, is that last time Trump had around him certain advisors who did openly disagree with him and even disobey him. This time, those kinds of guardrails, the cautious voices of restraint, appear not to be there. I mean, on the one hand, we have, as we know, these nominations which appear to sort of amount to, as one newspaper called them recently, that is Rubio, Waltz, Hesketh, a tough on China dream team. Was how I think the Wall Street Journal put it. But my question is, how are they going to interact with Trump, and how will they interact amongst themselves? There will be an incredible competition amongst the courtiers in this second Trump White House, I think. And Trump does, as I think has already been noted here, he does lack the ideological fervour of some of these nominees who like Rubio and Waltz, believe that China is an existential threat. So what Trump will we see? Will he be the big deal maker on North Korea or some kind of grand bargain with China? Or will he hunker down and agree with his advisors on strategic competition? The wild card, of course, is Elon Musk. I don't think Musk is going to be sort of on board with the Lighthizer agenda of tariffs on China if it eventually gets to that 60% mark, and we don't know how that Musk-Trump relationship will play out. So, are we going to see the deal maker with Trump, or are we going to see the strategic competition? From Beijing's perspective, a bit of relief, as I think again it's already been noticed here that Pompeo and Matt Pottinger don't appear to feature as yet in the lineup of this administration, or Mike Gallagher, who is in charge of the House Select Committee on China. We ought to remember too, in addition to Yo's point about Marco Rubio, he is still under sanctions from China. This is the first sitting Secretary of State who's actually prevented from travelling to China. Now, I gather there will be some kind of workaround that will be sort of achieved here, where the sanctions may be lifted for the office of the Secretary of State rather than lifted on Rubio himself. I'm not quite sure how you split that or actually work it, but I gather there is one. But I think from China's perspective too, if you have a cacophony of voices in the administration pushing for high tariffs on China, which is the last thing they need when their economy is under stress, at the same time as you have advisors who are from the camp or the school of thought, which says that the United States must reprioritize its strategic focus away from Europe and the Middle East towards Asia. Those two kinds of things combined is only, I think, going to strengthen the hand of the belligerents in Beijing as well, and that very intense and assertive Chinese nationalism. I think we can be sure that the China charm offensive in Europe, Latin America, and elsewhere will continue. I think we can be sure that China will continue to promote itself as the defender of multilateralism and globalization, and make the case that the United States is again walking away from some aspects of this. So I think we can expect to see sort of repeats of Xi Jinping at Davos. So they're the main points I see in the US-China dynamic, and of course we really have to wait and see about how Trump exploits the circumstances in front of him. These will be viewed through a personal, political, and national prism. But as ever with Trump, I think you can bet that the personal interest will be the one that takes priority. Now, in terms of the Australian reaction, well, on the one hand, at the moment, there has been, I think, a lot of confidence, similar to Japan. I mean, I think Australia was up there during the first Trump administration as one of the allies who, after a bit of a bumpy start in terms of a rough telephone call between President Trump and Malcolm Turnbull over the refugee deal, things did settle down. Australia was able to work very effectively with that Trump administration, mainly by working with sort of the mid to senior level officials in Washington. Now, there again is, I guess, another worry. If we see Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy take their kind of scythe halfway through the Washington bureaucracy, we can expect a pretty, I think, incoherent, jagged, potentially chaotic interagency process, right? I think that's probably my biggest worry, is what are we going to see in terms of implementation from this administration? We know they're in a rush, right, before the midterm elections, but how will the interagency process work out? But that distracts me. So there's confidence. Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, is talking a lot about and holding on, if you like, to the phrase that Trump told him in that first phone call, that Australia and the United States are going to have a perfect friendship. On the other hand, in other parts of the Australian media, there is certainly an intent to manufacture a sense of panic or even crisis about what kind of what Trump might mean for the US-Australia relationship. We're in the midst of a debate about whether the ambassador, Kevin Rudd, will survive, given his comments about Rudd before he assumed that position. And there's all sorts of, I think, worries about what Trump means for AUKUS. Now, I would think Trump, being a transactional foreign policy president, would look at the contribution that Australia is making to the US submarine industrial production line and say, well, there's an example of an ally that is actually stepping up, that is doing more. But he may want even more money. He may want Albanese to open up Australia's wallet even more. There is, I think, a bit of a concern. We still really don't know what Trump thinks about AUKUS. We don't know how he will react at that moment when an advisor briefs him on the deal and says, Mr. President, you realise that US submarine battle fleet numbers are not where we need them to be, and we have agreed to give Australia 2 or 3, perhaps up to 5 of the crown jewels of our nuclear submarine fleet. We just don't know how Trump will react at that moment. And I think there is probably some unspoken concern along those lines in Canberra. There seems to be, I think, a real desperation to make the point that AUKUS is going to be okay. But Pillar 2 is suffering at the moment from a lack of investment and a lack of buy-in from industry. There's been some very important gains in AUKUS Pillar 2. I wouldn't want to undercut that in any way, but and it's not on life support, But the thing is, the critical decision about AUKUS will have to be made by the next administration. And that's in terms of the transfer of submarines to Australia. But that doesn't mean that we can have 4 years of idleness on this policy while Trump's there. I think Australia is well down Trump's hit list. We might be collateral rather than targeted damage on trade. And lastly, I'll just say how all this plays out domestically is very important for both sides of Australian politics here. I don't think we'll hear a pipsqueak out of the Labor caucus that is critical of Trump or this administration, no matter what the outrage is. Where the government will be forced to respond is if, I think, the Greens, for example, are asking Albanese or senior government ministers to respond to the latest Trump outrage. That could put the government in a tricky position. But there are also landmines for the opposition leader, Peter Dutton. He's talked a lot about what he calls the eerie parallels between the Australian and US political contexts. Now, that could go both ways. Certainly there are commonalities on cost of living crises, on people feeling a loss of control. But at the same time, if Trump does go down an unpredictable route on foreign policy, if it becomes chaotic, we've just seen a poll in the Sydney Morning Herald which said that 57% of Australians don't want the country to take sides if there is a conflict between the United States and China over Taiwan. So this is where I think the sovereignty issue will come into play, right? That's an issue that hasn't got enough discussion as it should have, I think, in the AUKUS debate. But some of Trump's actions may well bring that, I think, to the fore over the next 3 to 4 years. We just have to wait and see, as I say, how this administration deals with what Emmanuel Macron called the beast of events. There's a lot of unpredictability in the strategic environment, and with an unpredictable president, that's the only certainty that we have at this stage.
Good. Well, thank you, James. Would the other two panelists like to put a question or comment to James? Thanks.
Yes, I would, John. James, thank you very much for the presentation. I do have a question. During the Biden administration, we're still in the Biden administration until January 20th, Japan and Australia stepped up because I think the United States really wants to keep the role as the offshore balancer. And even under President Biden, allies are meant to and expected to step up, to fill the gap. And there have been many unilaterals that are developed to strengthen the deterrence in the region. Do you think this will continue under the Trump administration? Do you think the Trump administration will in fact push this load, given the America First focus of the administration? Would allies be expected to carry on more of that load, and the offshore balancer will really be an offshore balancer?
It's a very good question, and I do expect it to continue. I think we can safely say, I think, that the putting together, the construction of the Asian lattice work has, I think, been a success of American statecraft, not just over the Biden administration, although they need to be given credit for the Japan-Korea rapprochement. And I think that strut was absolutely crucial to the broader strength of the lattice work. Now, I would expect this to, as I say, to continue, because I think one of the key dimensions of the lattice work is, as you say, a lot of these minilaterals, which don't necessarily, even though the United States clearly needs to be there and it has a presence in terms of its military engagement in the region, nevertheless, while ever China is perceived as a threat in East Asia, the lattice work will hold up, because these minilaterals and the cooperation between Japan and Australia, or Japan, the Philippines and Australia, Japan, Korea, and notwithstanding some domestic constituencies in both countries, which I know find that problematic, but the work amongst allies, even if Washington is not always there at the table, I think will continue. Even if we say the Trump administration will take some time out from it and won't be curating it as much as previous administrations have, I expect it to hold up. And I think in the case of Australia, I mean, certainly Australia and Japan, that defence cooperation is only increasing. That's another great example of work that goes on, which, whilst it happens clearly with the approval and the cooperation of the United States, is sui generis. But in the Australian case, I mean, there's no doubt we've seen in recent years an extraordinary intensification of what Australia is doing for the alliance with the United States, what it's providing for the US military posture in Asia. I mean, you've got congressmen coming out here saying that Australia is basically the base for the United States from which the United States can launch its counter-attack on the China threat. You won't hear that kind of blunt language from Canberra, but in recent years, as you know, we've given them a string of airfields across the north of Australia. In 2027, we will have a US nuclear submarine base on the west coast of Australia for British submarines and as well as American submarines. There's a lot of talk about logistics hubs in the middle of Australia. I think, you know, by any measure, if Trump is accurately briefed, he would have to look at both Japan and Australia and look at what they are doing in terms of their self-defense. Japan, as Yo knows only too well, has made great strides in terms of its ability to counterattack and the changes it's made to its defense posture. So there's clearly a lot there that I would have thought Trump would look at and like.
Thank you. You are muted, John.
Yeah, you are muted. Okay, so during this time, I can make a question to James, I think.
Yeah.
So I totally agree with the point, and I really appreciate what you said about, you know, we have to maintain lattice work of security partnership, and sometimes even we do without the presence of the United States. Yes,
Yeah.
that is what we have to do. And for that sake, I think, you know, we really make a kind of extensions of bilateral talks, like between Australia and Japan. You know, between Japan and UK, we just started, launched a new 2+2 for economic affairs, right? So I think, you know, in the coming years, we really need to come up with new ideas. How can we talk for economic affairs, you know, at a very high level, in bilateral way or unilateral way? And, you know, without the presence of the United States, that might be easier, I think, in coming years.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think it's up to countries like Australia and Japan to sort of save as much of the furniture as they can.
That's, I think, okay. Now I've got David Thomas. Okay, thank you.
John, now we can hear you.
I'm back on, yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
brilliant. Thanks very much for doing that, Yo. I do appreciate it.
Yeah, so Professor Curran.
Oh, no, that's fine. I agree with you. I think that we will see probably even more of a proliferation of these kinds of arrangements, which are basically saying that these countries want to keep as much of the architectural multilateral furniture as possible, and even if it is small building blocks that attempt to do this, well, that's better than nothing.
Totally agree. Thank you.
Okay, look, I just might put a question to all of the panelists. Under President Biden, there was some retreat from the concept of strategic ambiguity. Even though he was wound back by his officials, he twice at least made a comment which suggested that the time frame for strategic ambiguity was rapidly coming to an end. Now, Trump has never actually abandoned strategic ambiguity, though others around him, like Pompeo, have talked of an end of strategic ambiguity and even talked about independence for Taiwan. If this administration were to move away from strategic ambiguity and give some sort of undertaking on Taiwan to defend Taiwan, a firm undertaking, what do you think the reaction would be in other countries in the region? I'd put that to all three of you, if I may.
Should I go first, John?
Please do. Chee.
First, I know, Donald Trump, candidate Trump, has come out openly to say he would like to maintain strategic ambiguity because it improves his negotiating position. He may have colleagues around him who want him to go towards strategic clarity.
Disambiguity.
Clarity. Yeah. I think the president in the end will decide, because this will be a matter of war or peace. And whilst you have personnel is policy, in the end, the president will have certain issues that he will hold and monitor himself, and they are the issues that matter to him. And I think he will not want to see the United States dragged into war. That I think many people have said that is not in Trump's character. Should the United States really abandon strategic ambiguity and go towards some clarity during this period, I think everyone would sit up. It depends on how Taiwan reacts. Does this embolden them to react? Our concern is that China will then be forced to react. If Taiwan feels emboldened and declares or moves towards, policies that indicate they are independent, or let's say if the Trump administration decides to receive this the defense secretary from Taiwan, the defense minister from Taiwan, I mean, that's really, a step that's much further. How would China react? And I think the region would be extremely concerned about this. So, because it could mean war.
I see. Yeah. What's your view? How would it be taken in Japan, do you think?
Personally, I love strategic ambiguity. Personally, I love ambiguity. I love ambiguity.
You love ambiguity.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but I don't think President Trump will change his position on strategic ambiguity, because like national security advisors and other people might be positive to change the strategic ambiguity into a clarity. But I'm a little bit cynical, because even if Trump says, I will defend Taiwan, can we believe that? We don't know, right? This is Trump. It will be Trump, he always changes his mind, right? So if Biden says, I will defend Taiwan, very clearly, yes, it might be big things. But even if Trump says, I will go to defend Taiwan, can we really believe? I don't know.
Well, look, I agree with you, but if he said it, and if he said it clearly, and I agree he hasn't said it, and he's in fact endorsed it in the past, but if he did say he would move to strategic clarity, what do you think the reaction would be in Japan, given the importance of Japan in any American posture towards China over Taiwan?
We really want to keep stability. Stability is very important for us. And for that sake, I want to see United States would help Taiwan defense capability, as they have done last 4 years or last 8 years, right? But we don't need any, big diplomatic, how can I say, stimulation. I mean, diplomatic moves to stimulate China, right? What we really want to see is United States support to defense capability of Taiwan and also US defense capability in this region. So from my point of view, if Trump administration would have any preparation to change the strategic ambiguity, I think, our position is to ask them not to change.
I see. Well, that's good. Thank you very much for that view. What do you think, James? How do you think we deal with it? Any other perspectives?
I support strategic ambiguity as well. And obviously everything at the moment is pushing in the opposite direction to Trump coming out in a declaratory way and changing America's position on this. One thing that would interest me is to what extent would there be consultation with allies about it? And I'm not convinced that there would be intense or intimate consultation. I mean, in the past, when these great shocks have been announced by United States presidents, typically allies find out about them later or they read about them in the newspapers the next day. But look, were he to do it, despite what I said earlier about that recent poll, and I mean, it's not the only poll in Australia in recent times that has shown public doubt about following America into a war with China over Taiwan. We're in the position here where the parliament really wouldn't get a say. It would be the executive that makes the decision. And my feeling is that both for Japan and Australia, there's almost no choice. The alliance would not survive a decision by Canberra to hold out from that position or to oppose it. I see Australia very much as having locked itself into grand strategy on Asia. I think this is part of the problem in the recent sort of 10 to 15 years in terms of how interoperability has become interchangeability. Has Australia lost the ability to say no and influence American policy in such a way that doesn't lead to these kinds of changes, which could precipitate a war and therefore, something potentially catastrophic in East Asia? But I just say this too. I mean, to what extent really would Trump and Vance having campaigned, and particularly Vance, these guys have absolutely excoriated the Washington foreign policy establishment for the adventurism in Iraq and Afghanistan. It would, I think, be highly unlikely for either of them to start championing a change to this position of strategic ambiguity. They would surely know that if it did precipitate conflict, it would again be middle America and working class America that would bear the brunt. So is America prepared to pay the costs of defending Taiwan? Does it think it can beat China? I mean, in a military conflict? I think during the Biden administration, there were some in Congress and outside it, Pompeo, John Bolton. Clearly, there's a Republican element, right, that says bring on the conflict now while the United States has the possibility of a military or retaining its military advantage. But by the same token, China is growing in its own military capabilities, and I just can't see this change occurring under Trump or Vance. But it would be a stress test, I think, like no other for allies. Probably the biggest stress test since the China shock of Nixon and the Nixon doctrine of 1969. But
Thanks.
Much bigger.
Look, just another long question has come in, which I'll try and summarize. But it's essentially, if the panel could just enlarge a little bit on the economic impact of the region of, I suppose, two or three things. But the first would be a massive tariff placed on Chinese goods and the impact, therefore, on the Chinese economy, which would affect the rest of the region. And secondly, the impact of tariffs generally on countries in the region. And thirdly, the whole issue of dislocating the Western economies from the Chinese economy. And would pressure be put on other countries to move away from trade with China. That's the sort of thought that is coming out. The question is really, will there be a significant quantum of economic pressure placed on the region, which could really cause major adverse consequences economically for the region? Just your perspective on that, if you could.
I think the tariff, if they were increased 60%, maybe not 60%, there'll be bargaining, pushing back and forth, but higher tariffs would not be good news for the region generally, because as I've said before, we all belong to a production panel. The goods are produced in different ASEAN countries, it goes to China, value added is exported to the United States and to Europe. And the middle class, if I could put it this way, the middle class of Southeast Asia has been built upon this kind of trade. So it's really bad news for the region, is an economic slowdown, and what would follow could be contagious protectionism. American protectionism generates protectionism elsewhere. For the big countries like China, like India, Indonesia, you can practice protectionism. What does Singapore do? What do small countries do? Even Malaysia, we're so open, So it's not good news at all. This dislocating, this decoupling, we really are very concerned about it because we are tied to the production platform. And so I know that some companies have been talking and asking, what should they do? Are they going to sort of create new companies? One company in China to handle just the China production for China and other countries, and one which will just send stuff to the United States. It's very expensive. We'll cut into their profits. They don't know how this will work. I think, and cutting away, diverting trade from China. Chinese trade is extremely large with the region, and China, the Chinese economy is not just going to collapse, it is there. And in fact, there is alternative data to show that second, third, fourth tier cities in China are, not doing too badly. The bad news really comes from the first tier cities, So who's going to walk away from the Chinese market? In fact, I've heard very bullish investors from Europe and, and even the US saying that you can't walk away from the Chinese market, So I think the scenario you paint, John, I don't think people will play along with it. And more tariffs mean that Middle America will suffer. They have to pay for the inflation. And you have a midterm election coming on. After in 2025, you have another 2 years.
Inflation point is important.
Yeah, and the inflation will cost the Republicans votes too. So I think there will be some constraints.
Thanks very much. Yo?
Yes, I agree with her points, but also I think a Trump administration will use export control, investment control, and many regulations they will employ to ask us to change the supply chain network with China. But it is too difficult for us to cut off all economic dependency with China, right? And also this is a case with American companies, right? So we understand United States really want to make more economic security, and to reasonable level, we agree with that perspective. But if they ask us to change our supply chain network with China, including China, totally, this is totally impossible for us to do, right? Because we Asian economies are integrated so much already, right? And American companies also got a lot of advantage from this. They invest, they work here, right? So I think, we have to make clear this is just insane. And we have to say this, we have better way to handle, right? So
Okay, thanks
because,
very much, Joe. Thank you. Thank you very much. James, anything to add?
Oh, just very quickly, yeah, I agree with the economic insanity of it and the great difficulty that it would put on allies. I mean, I can imagine some of the strong-armed sort of hawks in the administration may well want to put some kind of pressure on Australia. And we've had a long history of various comments from senior American figures over the years who are a little bit nervous about how much Australia does trade with China. But nevertheless, we're coming off 3 years of a policy of stabilisation with China from the Albanese government that's had the tariffs removed that China did in a counterproductive way put on Australia. We've even got some new talk or revived talk, if you like. The Australian Prime Minister has even hinted that Canberra might be able to play the role of bridge between the United States and China on the whole question of this economic impact and trade and tariffs. Now, that might be a bridge too far. The opposition foreign affairs spokesman, Simon Birmingham, has said that he didn't think Australia was necessarily up to that at the moment. But Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, who may well be Prime Minister in the first half of next year, has said he wants more trade with China. So I don't think even the hawks in this coming administration will be pushing on an open door when it comes to that kind of advice to Australia.
James, I think in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN, we're hoping Japan, Australia as an ally will act as that bridge and point out about how disastrous an all-out trade war would be.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, look, I think in Australia there would be every hope that this would be the sort of approach that we would take with the Trump administration. I think, if you look at the 4 years of the previous Trump administration, I don't know that we were particularly adroit when it came to taking on that administration on issues that we differed from them. But we did stand up to our trade interests, and I'm sure we would do that again. But if we had differences, I think private differences on strategic issues, I'm not so sure that we would come to the party in a major way. Look, I think that's been very helpful. I could try and do a summary, but that would probably take me 5 or 6 minutes. But I would like to thank you all. I take particular point of the issues, the point that Chee made about the radical nature of the Trump administration perhaps being more pronounced internally than externally. Nonetheless, she and others mentioned that the problems arising from a very tough confrontational stance by the United States and China, and China's reaction to that, and a heightening of tensions between China and the United States would cause collateral damage for the rest of the region. I'm mindful of the fact that Japan, facing Trump too, is far more aware now, and I thank Yo on this, of far more aware of the issues dealing with the Trump administration. It's not quite as new as it was. But nonetheless, the new administration in Japan lacks the cohesion that existed under Abe, and that may be very important in Japan's dealings with the United States. Finally, the message that came through to me loud and clear, and this has come through also, I think, in a lot of the commentary since Trump's election, are the enormous complications of the sort of economic policies that Trump is seeking to bring to bear, and the difficulty in practice of putting those into effect. And the difficulty is not only, of course, for the region, China first of all, but all the countries dealing with China, but also, of course, for the United States itself, because of the inflationary effects of the sorts of programs that Trump is seeking to bring to bear. Anyway, the jury's going to be out for a while on it. I think we'll all watch with fascination. I deeply appreciate the preparedness of the three of you to be engaged in this seminar. The timing is right. It's shortly after the presidential election. Ideas are still fresh. And I think what you have said will colour the perceptions of a lot of those people who were listening to this particular webinar. And I very much hope that it will be disseminated further. So thank you very much indeed. I do appreciate it, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
much.
Bye.
Be in touch with all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for a really
Thank
insightful
you.
conversation. And thanks again to all our speakers and to you, John, as well.
And thank you, Leah, for helping me out on my sort of butterfingers on the computer. Okay.
Of course, a recording of today's conversation will be available for you to all view on our YouTube channel, and we look forward to seeing you again at one of our next webinars. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.